We welcome Christy Plant, who has been in recovery as a codependent for 13 years, 5 years with Celebrate Recovery, and 9 years with Al-anon. She is a devoted mother who has raised 4 kids, two girls that are 28 and 26, and two boys that are 22 and 19 years old. She has been divorced for 5 years, and she currently works full-time at a school and is a full-time student. She'll earn her bachelor's in business within a year. Also, Christy works a strong recovery program in the Cornerstone Recovery community in Houston, Texas. After experiencing her son's struggle with addiction and an episode of induced psychosis, she has been willing to share her experience, strength, and hope with all of us. And we're so very grateful she is. And so, Christy, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Aubrey. I'm so glad to be here. I'm a little bit nervous. I kind of wrote out what I wanted to say, so if I glance down sometimes or read a little bit, just bear with me. So I'm a recovering codependent, as she said. I struggle with codependency, and I didn't grow up in addiction. I haven't had addiction in my life until my son, who's now just turned 20. So he turned 20 in October. So you said he's 19, he's 20 now. So I hadn't had any experience with addiction until he had his addiction. But I'm very, very, very familiar with a lot of the isms of addiction. And growing up, and I thought I would share a little bit about my past, just to give you some context. And just wanted to make myself available if you hear struggles maybe that I have that you can relate to or need ever to reach out to me in any way. I just would want you to feel comfortable to do that. So I grew up in a home, and I didn't know until I was in Al-anon that I had a great aunt and a great uncle who were both alcoholics. And so my grandmother that raised my mother grew up with all of that. So my parents didn't even drink, but we had extreme religion, almost cult-like. So I guess a lot of things showed up that way. So there was still a lot of manipulation, control, a lot of the behaviors that you see with addiction that I grew up in. So codependency was forming in me, I'm sure, as I was growing up. So of course, I was attracted to relationships that really brought that out in me. And I just wanted to share also that I had a little bit of trauma in my upbringing. My dad, even though my parents didn't drink, my dad was actually hit by a drunk driver when I was 9 years old, and was life-flighted by helicopter to a hospital. And he lived for 4 years. He was in a coma for a year. But that trauma really also helped to develop me and form me, was very much a part of probably the reason why I had a lot of abandonment issues and some PTSD around abandonment and things like that. So that definitely played a part. He lived for 4 years and died when I was 13. And I got married when I was 18. And by the time I was 30, had 4 kids. And as she said, my oldest 2 are girls and my youngest 2 are boys. Felt very alone. A lot of crazy making conversations. We couldn't solve problems. I didn't really know what I was dealing with. And so my spinning out behavior and a lot of my codependent behavior, which a lot of times parents have when their child's in addiction, I had in that marriage. Just trying to change him, get him to show up for the kids. All the while, my oldest was ADHD and dyslexic. My second was ADD. When my third came along, by the time he was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with bipolar, ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder. And the child that I'm here to talk about today had no diagnoses. He was my easiest one, did well in school. It wasn't until he was about 18 years old that addiction started showing up. But in all of that craziness, I just really lost myself, if I ever even really knew myself in the first place, trying to change my husband at the time, trying to manage. I was real anti-medication. So I'd read every book I could get my hands on, trying to change my marriage, trying to fix my kids with diet, and just really just such chaos. And going to counseling, they referred me to a 12-step program, and I'd pretty much isolated up until that point in my life. With all the problems I was having with the kids, I just had a lot of shame. I grew up in a real shame-based home. And to me, I should have had control of my kids, should have had control of my life, and I did not. And it was very, it just led me to a real debilitating place because I isolated. That led to a lot of anxiety and depression. And by the time I went to the counselor, I was so spent. It was probably 17 or 18 years of marriage. I was so spent that I was ready to take a look at myself. Because at that point, I didn't even realize that I was a part of the equation. I was so codependent. And if you know what codependency is, you're so obsessed with other people around you, you just completely lose yourself. I didn't realize that there was a piece of the puzzle, and that was me, and that I could work on me, and changing my behavior could change my life. I just thought it was dependent on everything and everybody around me up until that point. So the counselor recommended a 12-step program, and that was the first time that I really reached out beyond myself and attached to community, which was huge. That was about 13 or 14 years ago, and that was a huge paradigm shift for me. My entire journey changed. That was through the church I was in, Celebrate Recovery. And I did that recovery for about 5 years and learned to start setting boundaries and showing up for myself. But I kind of hit another bottom in that recovery program whenever I started realizing that I was in a passive aggressive, emotionally abusive marriage. I really didn't have that clarity and didn't know that. And when I started realizing I was in abuse, I knew that I couldn't stay in abuse. And I knew I just needed to find somewhere where other people struggle with codependency. So the only place I knew to look was Al-anon. So I joined Al-anon, which was my saving grace. So many people in that program that have strong recovery. And even though they're dealing with alcoholism, and I couldn't really pinpoint what I was dealing with, my behaviors were completely the same as theirs. So I joined Al-anon and started learning self-care and how to take care of myself, and how to set boundaries. And it was a real game changer for me. And through that, just a natural process was I ended up getting divorced. I tried years and years and years of counseling, but that relationship was very crazy making, and it was my saving grace to get out of it, to gain my serenity and my peace and my sanity back. So anyway, through the separation and through the divorce, both of my boys went to live with their dad. That was a really painful process for me. One thing that happened is my kids turned on me through that. And so I had to do a lot of letting go. They were old enough. Zach, my youngest, was, 15 or 16, and he really needed to be able to make his own decisions. And I couldn't co-parent with my ex at the time. And so I really just had to let go. There was a lot of grieving that went involved because I wasn't ready to just not be a mom anymore. But I really didn't have a choice. I had to let go because trying to co-parent was insanity. So I wasn't going to try to do that. So I really grieved that out, let go, and focused on me, and, was in school, working, doing well, very, very happy. And it was in 2020 that my son was 18 at the time. He had just graduated high school, and he showed up at my doorstep, and he was talking crazy. He seemed manic, and I was familiar with mental illness because my mother-in-law was paranoid schizophrenic. And so I knew enough about it. I'd read a lot about it, and I'm like, oh my God, when this comes on, it's usually in the early 20s. And so I could clearly tell Zach was in some kind of a psychosis, mania. He was something, but I just didn't know what. And so I talked to him, and although it was kind of all over the place, he did seem very alert. And so, all of a sudden, first I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm dealing with mental illness. Mental illness is coming on. It's hereditary. And then I had the presence of mind to ask him if he had done any drugs. And he said, well, the only drugs I do come from the earth. I only do natural drugs. I only do marijuana comes from the earth. Mushrooms come from the earth. That's all that I would do. And And so I just let him talk. And I asked him, so have you done any? Have you done any mushrooms? Have you done any marijuana? Have you done any synthetic marijuana? And he kind of was talking in circles, and I kind of didn't ever get a clear answer. But by the time he left, I kind of was suspicious. And so I started researching it after he left. And I thought, and it sounded just like having, like if somebody was on mushrooms and they were tripping on mushrooms, like described his behavior almost identical. He thought that he discovered all the, keys to his life and the universe and spirituality. He was just, but he talked in circles and didn't make a lot of sense. And so when he left, I thought, when he sobers up, when he comes to, we'll have a conversation about it. So at about 7:00 that night, he called me back. And he said, I bet you're not surprised to hear from me. And I'm like, no, I'm not at all. He said, well, I'm coming over. I'm like, okay. He's humiliated. He wants to save face. He was strung out on mushrooms, probably having a major trip, and really regrets coming over here to see me. But when he got there that night, was a very different story. He was very, very dark, making a lot less sense. Was saying things to me like, Mom, please tell me that, suicide is not the answer. And I'm like, no, Zach. And when I had read, it talked about you could have a bad trip on mushrooms, and so drinking orange juice would help. You really need to eat. And so I'm just like, he had told me when he was home earlier, he hadn't slept the whole night before. He, when he got there that night, he hadn't eaten all day. So I'm just thinking, I need to get food in him. I just need to get food in him. And then when I get food in him, maybe he'll be okay. And I took his keys. I definitely didn't want him driving. So I sat down in the driver's side of his car, and he wouldn't get in the car. And he was just talking gibberish, not making a lot of sense. And he actually reached in the car and grabbed the keys from me, and it scared me. Just the way he was talking to me, it just seemed like he could be violent. And I knew I wasn't going to try to, go toe to toe with him. So I just let him take the keys. And while he was sitting in the driver's seat, he asked me again, does paranoia run in our family? I said, well, you know that your nanny's paranoid schizophrenic. And he started the car, and he just started screaming like at the top of his lungs, just driving away really fast. Scared me really, really bad, because I knew he was completely not there in any way, shape, or form. And it looked like a psychotic break, what I would imagine a psychotic break, what I had heard a psychotic break to sound like. I learned later that he was afraid that I was going to try to kill him. He was afraid I was going to try to murder him. And honestly, at the same time, I didn't feel safe in his presence either. He was so volatile, and I just didn't feel safe. So I don't remember if I called the police first or if I called his dad first. I think I called the police first and just told him, no, I think I called his dad first to get his license plate number and any information he may have. I called the police, told him where he had left from, where I was hoping he was going, which was to his dad's house. And they got his phone number, and he had a flip phone. And that's a whole nother story that I think that he'll share whenever he gives his story to you guys. But he had a flip phone. So I was scared to death, because, if you have a smartphone, they can find you. But since he had the flip phone, I didn't know if the police were going to be able to find him. And I told him he's not stable. I think he's having a psychotic break. I don't know if he could be a danger to somebody else, to himself. I mean, I literally could just, with as out of control as he was, I could picture him just ramming his car in a building. I just knew he was completely, the Zach I knew was 100% not present. And so I got a call eventually that, stayed on the phone with his dad, and eventually his dad said, he's here. And I had told his dad, gotten together, if he gets there, take his keys, whatever you do not let him leave. And so when he got to his dad's, he was clearly out of it, talking to the police about all the political and spiritual and just conspiracy theories he had been reading online. It was just all over the place. And so the police called an ambulance, and they took him to the hospital, to the ER. And I talked with the ER once he got there. I was on the phone with them and talked to him. I just remember being so scared, but feeling like I was so glad that he was just in the ER and he was in a safe place. And so I just prayed through the night. And with the recovery that I had, the serenity prayer is what, it's just what speaks to me. It's what helps me. If I'm in anxiety and I'm really, really struggling, say I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm going through something, I will say the serenity prayer over and over and over in my head so that my head doesn't spin out in other directions. It just brings me so much sanity. So that night, literally, I said the serenity prayer over in my head. I don't know for how long. I didn't let other thoughts come in. And I just said the serenity prayer. It got me through the night, and I actually slept. I credit that to the recovery that I'd had up until that point, that I could even sleep through the night, because I don't think if something like that had happened 5 years earlier, that I would have been able to sleep through the night. So the next morning they said I could come and get him. He was making a lot more sense. He had calmed down. And so he got in the car. And at that point he said, Mom, I want to come live with you. I think I need that. And we went to, the other thing is they had taken his blood work in the hospital, and the only thing that had showed up was marijuana. And so there was no mushrooms that showed up in his system. So he had not used mushrooms. And he had told me at that point it had been about a month since he had used mushrooms. So it was only marijuana that they found in his system. I took him to eat. He couldn't eat because he was having major withdrawals, which I had heard you weren't supposed to have from marijuana. But he was very, very sick, had to go to the bathroom, was throwing up, couldn't eat. And he came home and seemed to just be doing okay for a little while. But then I could tell that his cognition, he was going downhill. He was starting to talk about paranoid things again and things like that. So I called my counselor, and she recommended a psychiatrist's office. It was actually one that my other son had used, and I called them, and they referred me to Woodland Springs, which was a mental health hospital that wasn't too far from me. So I took him to the mental health hospital, and we were there for a long time. The whole check-in process was a major ordeal, and he continued to decline the whole time that we were there, getting closer to what I had seen the night before. And just talking in circles, trying to figure things out, thinking that he made sense, but he didn't make sense. And they checked him in, and I can just remember leaving there just sobbing and crying. I mean, I was really scared at that point. Would he ever come back? Like, the person that I knew was just gone. And he was in Woodland Springs for about a week, and they put him on antipsychotic medications. And he came out of psychosis, I guess. When I picked him up after about 7 days, he was still manic. He still had grandiosity. Like, there was still some things, and he was very high strung, very anxious, pacing all the time. So he was far from himself. That's for sure. And so he went to a couple of days of outpatient there, but he came home on the second day and said, there's people smoking pot, using in the parking lot during breaks. I'm like, well, that's not the answer. So we looked into the Memorial Hermann. We put him, and this was during COVID. So Memorial Hermann was not offering in-person meetings. It was only through Zoom. I think it was like Monday through Thursday, 2 to 3 hours on Zoom. And I knew that was not going to cut it. We did 4 days of that. He was climbing the walls, and he was seeing a counselor with Memorial Hermann. And I went into the first counseling session that Zach had with him. And Zach was, he had done the Woodland Springs a couple days. He had done Memorial Hermann for about 4 days. He was talking a really good talk. And if you know Zach, I mean, when he comes and presents, you'll be very impressed. Zach is so well-spoken. And the counselor just looked at him and he said, Zach, you are so well-spoken and you so look like you have it together that I feel like people trying to help you are not going to truly realize how much help you really need. And for whatever reason, when that counselor said that, and I'm sitting there, like a light bulb just went off in my head. And I knew about Cornerstone because I'd been in Al-anon, and there were other parents in Al-anon whose kids had attended Cornerstone, which is an APG. I don't know if Aubrey shared with y'all what Cornerstone is. And I had heard about Kirk, who leads Cornerstone, like his reputation way precedes him as being very hardcore recovery. He's an addict himself with a lot of recovery. And I guess, Zach was the younger one. And even with all my recovery was on codependency. I didn't understand addiction. And I remember calling my counselor and go, Zachary's climbing the walls. He needs something that's all encompassing. He needs mentors. Like, this is not going to cut it. I had enough Al-anon to know that we're dealing with addiction. It's not going to go away. We got to get help. And then spending enough time with him to realize he's really good and savvy. And is anybody going to really, and I just thought of Kirk. I thought, you hear the saying, you can't bullshit a bullshitter. And my counselor just told me, she said, Christy, only addicts can help addicts. You cannot try to wrap your brain around this. And even in my mind at that point, he's my baby, he's 18, Kirk's going to be really hard on him. Could he handle that? Would that break him? My thinking was so, even with all the recovery I'd had, my thinking was so backwards. And she just said, I would make sure that he is with Kirk. And I think Cornerstone would be great for him, but I wouldn't do it unless you're going to do the outpatient, and it's very intensive. And so after that, we went and did the intake with Cornerstone, and Zach was real on board and really, really wanted to do it. But the first event he went to, and it felt a little awkward. He wanted to be out. He did not want to do this. I could just remember my anxiety going so high, thinking, okay, now we're going to find this, and then this is what's going to help him, and he's going to be on board. And it wasn't like that at all. He wanted out. He did not want to do this recovery program, and really scared me and made me nervous. And so I reached out to the counselors there at Cornerstone, and they really helped me. I reached out to a couple of the other parents that I knew their kids had gone through Cornerstone, and they were just so strong. And they said, he's an adult, he can do whatever he wants to do, but what kind of boundaries and what guidelines are you going to put in place? And, he wasn't going to live in my house and not work Cornerstone, because first of all, I didn't have a plan B. And I knew with all the recovery that I had, that doing nothing or leaving it to him to show up to a meeting or not show up to a meeting, it just wasn't going to work. And so my ex, we really hadn't had to have any dealings or co-parent up until this point. And the counselors really helped me with that too. And I was in a lot stronger place than what I'd ever been with dealing with him before. And I think at this point, my ex was scared too. And I just said, look, we either stand together or he falls. Are you willing to stand with me and say he does not have a place to live, and we will take his car if he chooses? Because Zach at this point was putting his, really digging his heels in and saying, I will not show up to Cornerstone again. In fact, he came to me and said, so I'm just going to let you know that I won't show up to Cornerstone again. And if I can't live here, that's okay. You just need to let me know that. So it was real important that his dad stand firm with me in that. And his dad was like, Christy, this is so hard for me. And I just said, well, then what's your plan B? What are we going to do if we don't do this? And he didn't have an answer. And so he said, okay, let me talk to him. And somehow he got Zach to the meeting the next day. And for the first time ever in our entire parenting relationship, he stood firm with me, knowing that this was the best thing for Zach. And if we didn't do this, we didn't know where Zach would end up. So at this point, Zach sees a united front from his mom and his dad. Thank God it was my saving grace, and I will forever be grateful for that, because if we didn't have that, I don't know how our situation would have turned out. And so Zach decided, okay, if I'm going to do Cornerstone, in Cornerstone, we have what's called hosting, where the kids can go stay with other families. He went and stayed with a real seasoned family that had real strong recovery for about 6 weeks to learn the ropes, because it was a lot of work. And that was another reason why Zach wanted out, because his MO up until that point, he quit anything when it got hard. He just would quit. He halfway tried through school. He and still made good grades because he was smart. And so he went ahead and moved in with that family, and that was huge because it gave me a break. It gave me 6 weeks of a break, and it gave him a break from me and to really work his recovery hard. When he came back home after 6 weeks, and those 6 weeks were turbulent, he had stopped taking his antipsychotic medications. Luckily, he did balance out, but he went through a lot of depression, a lot of up and downs during that time, just mental health issues. That I was kind of having to monitor at a distance and still go to doctor's appointments with him and things like that. So when he came back home, he had decided to work his recovery, and he was really mentally balancing out, where the mania wasn't there. He was completely making sense, and decided to really, really fully work recovery. So I was really grateful for that. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to share before. In Cornerstone, it's real parent driven. So the parents meet and do 12-step studies. So once joining Cornerstone, because I'm on the parent committee with that now, there's 2 to 3 meetings a week with that. I don't do Al-anon anymore. I do that parenting program, which is awesome because I hadn't really worked as much on my codependency with parenting as I had with the marriage. And so, and you would think with all the recovery I had, with all the boundaries, that it was easy, as Zach bucked it for about, the first month not wanting to be there, but it was really, really hard. I just wanted to share that it was really, really hard, and it was imperative that I reached out to other people, because my thinking could just get really, really off. Like I would have thoughts of, what if he hates me for the rest of his life? What if this is horrible for him? What if this damages him? What if he gets in there and he's with other kids that use worse drugs? And then he's, my mind was just going to all these places. So it took me really reaching out to counselors and to people who had been on the same road before me to really speak to me, to help me to see reality and what I really needed to see and what the right choices really, really were. And this program's been huge for me in setting boundaries. Still to this day, every time I need to set a boundary with him, I second guess myself. It's hard. I try to think of a way around that. It's just so uncomfortable for me. But I have the accountability and the people that I reach out to. So since he's been in the program, he had a couple of relapses when he was in the program, not with marijuana, but with alcohol early in the program. The first month he got in the program, didn't find out till months later. And then he found his dad's ADHD medication and took that to be able to focus better, to do his step work. So that was considered a slip because that was not okay. He was taking something to feel different. He wasn't being honest about it. He was hiding it. He ended up coming forward with those things. In the program, when he's had slips like that, they're called shots. So he knows we have certain things on our refrigerator. He knows if he doesn't follow certain things, what the consequences will be. And so I've had to call shots. It's hard. I've had to kick him out. Sometimes it might be an amends letter that he needs to write to me. The last slip that he had about 6 months ago, he has another addiction that I think he'll share with y'all that's not a chemical addiction. And he works a program for that addiction too, and has had a lot more slips with that program. And so has really begged me to completely hold him accountable in that program. And so the last time with that one, I actually was going to send him to a halfway house, but they didn't let him come and stay because I guess he didn't meet the criteria to stay. So he slept in the garage for a week, and we took away his car for a week, and he just had to drive. He had to ride the bus into Houston. Those kinds of things are really, really hard for me. But each time that I set those boundaries and I call those shots, I notice a shift in him, and he grows. And I think part of the reason is because in Cornerstone, it's a program that's, he's working his program. They're teaching him honesty and accountability and how important it is that you're held accountable for your behavior. And so because I'm working my program and he's working his program together, when I call the boundaries, when I make him accountable, when I give the consequences, he's more open to receiving it. Before recovery, it was a complete nightmare setting boundaries with him. But anyway, so that's been really, really big for both of our recoveries. He is now sponsoring. He has a sponsor or two sponsors, and I'm just forever grateful. He's the first person in my family that I've been able to share recovery with, so we can speak the same language. He still lives with me. He stays with his dad on the weekends, and he's about to graduate from the outpatient program. He'll still be in the program. He'll still be working the steps. He's been able to go back to work. He took a medical leave of absence. He worked at HEB, took a medical leave of absence when he got in Cornerstone. So he's slowly been incorporating more hours of work back in, but Cornerstone takes up so much of his time that he's not had a lot. He's doing yoga now. He's playing softball through the program, and pretty soon won't be going to the outpatient anymore. It'll be second stage outpatient, which will just be once a week. He's been in the program a little over a year, and I think he'll probably stay in the program at least 3 years. That's about the average time. And in the program, they talk about 5 years of recovery is early recovery. So it's real important that I don't let down my guard, that I keep my boundaries strong in my home, that my home will be sober. I don't accept any disrespect from him, even the smallest, slightest disrespect. A shot's called and there's a consequence given, because I believe that we teach people how to treat us. And that was one of the last times that I had to call a shot. I was kind of like, I don't know, when you're in the situation, you're so close to it, there were little bits of disrespect that were creeping up in our relationship. And I didn't realize it till it was, kind of a little bit out of control. He was just really shutting me out, being condescending, sarcastic, and it just really crept in and I didn't realize it. And I realize now I've got to really stay on guard for that. So just last week I said, I didn't like that tone that you took with me. I need an amends letter immediately. And that forces him to have to stop, think through the way he was talking to me, write it out. That's only possible because of the program that we're in. Definitely that's only possible because of the program that we're in. Just wanted to see if there's anything else that I wanted to share. I think if there's anything that I just want to leave you with before I'm done, it's that what I've learned through recovery and before my recovery before Zach had this and the recovery since is that it's not possible to get better on our own. I don't believe there's no way. I read one time that mental illness goes up 40% when people isolate. And one of the Cornerstone meetings, they said there's several things that have to be in place for teens to get sober. And one is their group of friends. So peer support, that has to change. That has to be healthy. The dynamics in the home have to change because I've learned through recovery that I didn't cause this. And thank God I'd worked through a lot of my shame and Al-anon before I came into this. So I wasn't beating myself up. I knew he had choices. I knew I contributed and I didn't have to feel shame and I didn't have to beat myself up because I contributed. We could start from here and go forward. But the dynamics of the home have to change. When parents are in shame and they're battling shame themselves, I know for all the years that I was in shame, I was shaming my kids constantly. I'm grateful that through this process, I've not shamed him because of the work that I had done in the years leading up to this. And it's because I wasn't feeling shame. I don't feel shame. I can sit here with you and say, I have a son that struggles with addiction, he has process addiction. He'll turn to anything to try to feel different, to try to feel better. And I don't have shame about that. We're all broken. My codependency is not really any different. It's almost like it's like an addiction. that I have to battle and that I have to stay on top of, and that I have to work a hard recovery program to stay emotionally sober. And so anyway, that's the main thing that I would share, that healing takes place in community and with people that are healthier than us and that have gone before us and walked the same path as us. And that's what's changed everything for me in the different areas in my life where I've experienced healing. So anyway, thanks for letting me share with y'all today. Where a lot of things were said, like, what's wrong with you? Why would you do that? There was a lot of judgment in my home where we judged everybody on the outside. Well, at least we're not like that. We have it together. And the life I had with my kids and all this mental illness, and I experienced so much shame in parenting because I couldn't hold it together. I couldn't create. I took it on instead of realizing my kids have these diagnoses. And so say we were in the grocery store, my kids were little, I introduced them to somebody and they're just so rude. We would get in the car, I would berate them because of my own humiliation and shame that I felt in the way that, say, they treated my friend. So what I was saying is, if this same thing had happened to Zachary early in my recovery, I really beat myself up. I thought, really had a God complex. If my kids turn out great and they turn out perfect, it was all me that did that. If they turn out horrible, it was all me that did that. Like it would rise and fall based on what I did. I took it on. And it just had the idea that my life was supposed to look a certain way. And when it didn't look that way, I experienced a lot of shame. I feel like I was really defective because this is what my life looked like. By the time this happened to Zachary, I had worked through those things and I didn't feel shame. I could just be present for him in his shame that he felt. It's not that I didn't shame him growing up, for sure. My kids grew up in a shame-based home, but the longer I was in recovery and the more healing I got and the less shame I felt, the less I shamed them, which shaming them would be, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing that? Why can't you just get it together? Because I feel defective because I raised you and you're this way, then I'm going to put that off on you that you're defective too. So with my adult children that don't live with me, I don't set shots up for them. I only set, because they don't live with me, they don't live in my house. They're free to live their lives however they want until it affects me in my home, and then I would address it. But shots for Zach is, my shots in my home are if there's disrespect, if there's dishonesty, if you're not working your program, if there's a relapse of using chemicals or his other addiction, these are the consequences that'll happen. And so it's just already set up, so it's no surprise. They already know ahead of time, you see these behaviors, this is the shot that's going to be called. Were you specifically asking for a child that's older and doesn't live with you? Because if you are, I can give an example of how I've set a boundary with my older kids that way.
Yeah, a specific example.
Okay.
If a boundary. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just give you an example of one of my older son who doesn't live with me now, and that's a whole nother story. He's gotten help. It was a physical condition that he had surgery for. He's not bipolar anymore. He still does have some ADHD, but the neurological problems he was having was from a problem in his gut. So as an adult, I don't know, he was 18 or 19. He's 22 now, and he's, ADHD can be very impulsive, and he kept badgering Zachary and wouldn't stop. And so I told, you need to stop. If you don't stop, I'm going to ask you to leave my home. And that made him mad. He left. He didn't speak to me for another 3 weeks, but he doesn't do that in my home anymore. So that was just a way of, you're not going to be disrespectful in my home. If you don't listen to me, then you're going to need to leave. Or if I was in another public place, I would just leave so that I'm not subjecting myself to it. With my older daughter, when I first started setting boundaries and she wasn't in the house, I told her, I really love you. I'm learning to love myself. And so I'm going to do things a little different going forward. So I just want you to know, if you talk to me disrespectful, I'm going to change how I handle it with you. I may remove myself. I just want you to know ahead of time that I'm not mad at you. This is just a way I'm respecting myself. And that was a way that I handled it with her early on. We couldn't co-parent once we were divorced. So what I did is I completely backed out for my own peace and serenity and peace of mind. When my sons went to live with their dad, I backed out completely. If they called me and said, Dad wants to know if your dad's raising you now. And so lots of grief. I grieved hard. To completely let go and to completely detach, because I was not willing to sacrifice my peace and serenity. And I didn't have control. We don't get to control anybody else but ourselves. So when Zach decided he wanted to live with me, I can't take any credit for that his dad decided to get on the same page. I think being a part of Cornerstone, both being held accountable by the counselors. I think his dad maybe seen us in psychosis. I think maybe God, I don't know, if his dad would not have gotten on the same page with me, there's not anything that I could have done. I would have been powerless over that. What I could have controlled was whether he was going to live with me or not. But I wasn't going to live in the crazy of trying to change his dad and convince his dad. That wouldn't have been an option for me, because in my recovery, my peace and serenity is my number one priority. I won't sacrifice it for one of my children. I won't sacrifice it for anybody anymore. So if Zach wants to live in my home and he wants to abide by my boundaries and my rules, then I want him there. If he continued to triangulate with his dad, undermine me, his dad didn't stand with me, his dad was going to give him a safe place to go, I would have been 100% powerless over that. And all I could have done was work my own program to create my own life and my own happiness, and what I needed to be okay, regardless of what they did. I could only do that with recovery, could only do that with a strong support system, going to meetings every week, several times a week. Like, that's the only way for me. You just have to decide what you're willing to participate in. And I'm not willing to participate in anything that's going to cause me a lot of stress, take over my life, keep me from my own dreams and goals. I'm not going to participate in that. So I started out in Celebrate Recovery, and I had my first sponsor there, and took me about a year to get through the steps, and I was in a 12-step study. So I guess just answering the questions, being in community, being in group, the questions really lead you through to open you up. Are you familiar with the steps at all? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, I guess they just really helped me see myself, especially with step 4. Took me a really long time to get through step 4, probably filled up an entire spiral, just seeing my patterns. And I kind of did my 4-step one person at a time. I kind of found like my recovery has been, I've actually had 4 sponsors up until this point. I had one in Celebrate Recovery, then I got into Al-anon and had a sponsor, and we weren't a fit. And then I had my second sponsor in Al-anon, and she's no longer with Al-anon. So then I had my third sponsor, because what I found is if I keep working the steps and I'm going to my meetings every single week, which I have always done, I'm going to keep growing and reach out to people like crazy. Like I have a list of 20 people. If I'm dealing with a situation, I'm going to call somebody that's ahead of me on the journey so they can bring me clarity, not for them to tell me what to do, but so they can share their experience with me. And then now that I'm in Cornerstone, I have my second sponsor in Cornerstone. So I don't just reach out to my sponsor, I reach out to all my winners in the program. And I also didn't mention this, but I worked ACA. So I've done the 12 steps through ACA and done a lot of work on reparenting myself. That's been huge in helping to free me from shame. ACA actually says adult children of alcoholics or any other dysfunction. Yeah. So if you grew up with any dysfunction in the home, ACA is going to cover it.
Truthfully, it's inspiring because I got to tell you, it sounds like his recovery is much, it just worked faster than it does for most kids, from what I can tell. I mean, this marijuana addiction and this marijuana-induced psychosis, this is just horrible. So I hand it to you for doing all the good work you've done.
Yeah. I hand it to Cornerstone because without Cornerstone, they keep those kids so busy and so accountable. He didn't have time to do one other thing in his life. That program was all encompassing. So,
okay.
So I give so much credit to Cornerstone.
Honestly. Well, I know it's a great community. I mean, Aubrey tells me enough about it. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and credit to Cornerstone, but as you can tell from Christy's testimony, she set the boundary and she didn't wave from it. Even though she's feeling her codependency, she worked through it. And I can tell you from talking to many, many families, they're not ready to set those boundaries. Christy made that decision. She set it and she held them. And that's the thing. You got to hold the boundary once you set it. And she knew where to get support for herself. So Cornerstone does teach us that, but Christy needs to take credit because the parent drives the recovery, especially in Cornerstone. So it's amazing. I still call shots now and I'm like, oh, did I do the right thing? And Christy, could you talk just briefly about, Christy does host other teens, young adults in her home. And I know I've talked to this group about that, that I've done it too. Could you talk about how that enhances your recovery program?
In Cornerstone, one of the things that really helps is it's really scary setting boundaries with your own teen because you're so emotionally attached. And so you go through all this. And I just wanted to say before I go into that what courage is it's doing something while we're scared. So I might be shaking in my boots, calling that boundary, scared to death, having self-doubt, but he doesn't know that. And that's how it's like a muscle memory. It gets stronger, but that's what courage is. It's taking the action while you're scared. And so that's what I've learned through recovery. I've had to do lots of things while I'm scared. Can't let fear dictate what I do. And anyway, so what I was going to say is, so I've hosted several boys in my home. I have one that has been in my home. I've had to kick him out a couple times. And in Cornerstone, when, that's calling a shot. I've had to kick him out because he's been entitled or become complacent or whatever. It's a lot easier to do with somebody else's child. And it's a lot easier to see in somebody else's kid because you don't have all the emotion attached to it that you do with your own. And so, and he's asked to come back and given me amends and self-corrected. And I've watched him grow a lot over the last year. He spent last Christmas with us. So that's how long he's been with us now. And so that's been really, that's big. And it's big for Zach too, because it holds Zach accountable. He has to be everywhere Zach is. He has to go everywhere Zach goes. And it's funny because Zach has to hold him accountable the way I hold Zach accountable. And so the first time we kicked him out, I remember Zach just saying, why can't he just do what he's supposed to do? I'm like, I know, right? Now you know exactly how it feels to be a parent. He's like, yeah, but you have all this experience. And I said, Zach, it never gets easier. It stays really hard. Anyway, he got to experience, as he's hosting somebody in his home, he gets to experience what it's like to be a parent. So that's growth for him too. And then it's growth for me because I get practice on somebody that I'm not as attached to and helps build my muscles in setting boundaries. Right. Yeah. And that's what makes boundaries so scary is we're not guaranteed an ending. And that's the fear. And we're not guaranteed the outcome. A lot of times we set the boundaries. My son didn't speak to me for 3 months like I talked about, but he came back and we're in way better relationship now. Okay. There's no guarantees when you set the boundaries. You're right. And so that keeps us stuck a lot of times. Yeah.